Step back. People Derek are authorized to be here. The words hit the tarmac like a verdict. Damien Volkov didn't move. He never did. Not when strangers misjudged him. Not when security began circling. Not even now, with rain sliding cold off the wing of a private jet that belongs to no one standing in that crowd but him. He simply looked at the woman blocking his path and let the silence stretch a half-second longer than was comfortable. "I'm boarding my aircraft," he said. "No." Vanessa Brooks's voice carried, sharp and certain, across the private terminal. "You're attempting to board someone else's." Everyone nearby heard it. A ground crew member froze mid-step. 2 pilots near Gate 3 turned their heads. Somewhere behind the gold velvet rope, a businessman lowered his phone from his ear, sensing, the way crowds always seemed to sense, that something worth watching was about to happen. Damien stood perfectly still. Rain had darkened his hair at the temples and beaded along the shoulders of his charcoal 3-piece suit, though the fabric hadn't so much as wrinkled. A leather travel bag hung from one hand. In the other, he held a single folded authorization document between 2 fingers, light as nothing. His expression gave away exactly as much as a locked door. Vanessa stepped closer, one hand raised flat, as if she could hold him back through will alone. 11 days into her promotion as supervisor of executive aviation services, and she intended for every person watching to understand she had earned the title. "This terminal," she said, loud enough for the entire charter lounge to hear, "is reserved for verified owners, not for men who walk up in expensive suits expecting the staff to assume." "I agree," Damien said. She blinked. That wasn't the answer she built her morning around. He held up the document. "Authorization, ownership records. I'd ask you to verify them before this goes any further." Vanessa didn't reach for it. "I don't need to verify a forgery. You haven't looked at it. I don't need to look at it to know what it is." Something in her certainty thinned the air between them. 2 security officers reached her shoulder and stopped, waiting on her word like dogs at a fence line. A small crowd had gathered the way crowds always do at airports. Slowly, then all at once, a woman near the rope lowered her phone, hesitated, then lifted it again, this time recording. A flight attendant in a navy uniform whispered something to the man beside her. Near the back, a silver-haired businessman in a charcoal coat said, "Not quietly enough. If it's really his jet, let him prove it." Damien didn't turn toward him. He had heard that sentence before. In boardrooms where investors spoke past him to the man standing behind him, in hotel lobbies where clerks asked if he was waiting for a guest, in rooms where his worth had already been decided before he opened his mouth. The sentence never changed. Only the suit it wore did. Vanessa's eyes moved over him. The tattoos visible at his collar, the dark stubble, the wet hair, cataloging each detail as evidence for a verdict she'd already reached. "Men like you," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable to the onlookers, "try this every season. New suit, fake paperwork, hoping no one checks." "Then check," Damien said. She didn't. Instead, she reached out and took the folded document from his hand and tore it cleanly in half. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone gasped. The recording phone tilted up higher. Damien looked down at the 2 halves of paper now resting in Vanessa's grip, then back at her face. Nothing in his expression changed. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle her. "Security," she said, snapping her fingers without looking away from him. "Escort him off the property." The 2 officers stepped forward, flanking him on either side. Neither touched him. Something about the way he stood made them hesitate to. Damien held Vanessa's gaze. "Is this your final decision?" The question landed strange in the wet air. Too calm, too composed for a man supposedly being thrown off airport property. A few people in the crowd exchanged uncertain glances, as if the script had quietly shifted beneath their feet, and only Damien seemed to notice. Vanessa lifted her chin, drawing on the confidence of every eye now watching her. "Absolutely. You will never board someone else's jet. Not today. Not on my terminal." Damien said nothing. He reached into his jacket, slow enough that the security officer's hands twitched toward their belts, and drew out his phone. He didn't dial a contact. He didn't scroll. He simply pressed one saved number and lifted the phone to his ear. "Activate protocol, Raven." 10 seconds. No raised voice. No threat. No further explanation. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket as casually as a man confirming a dinner reservation. Vanessa laughed, short, sharp, performed for the crowd now fully assembled along the rope. Is that supposed to frighten? Damien didn't answer. He simply stood in the rain, travel bag in hand, and waited, the same way he always had, letting people reveal exactly who they were, long before the consequences ever arrived to meet them. None of them understood yet that the clock had already started. 20 minutes. She thought she'd just thrown a stranger off a terminal. She had no idea whose jet she was standing in front of. In 20 minutes, the truth arrives, and nothing about this airport will ever be the same. Keep reading to find out exactly who Damien Volkov really is, and why one phone call was about to bring an entire international airport to its knees. Don't stop now. Chapter 2 reveals the empire hiding behind his silence. To understand why Vanessa Brooks's laughter would soon die in her throat, you first had to understand who Damien Volkov actually was, and almost no one did. He was not the kind of man people imagined when they heard the word boss. There were no gold chains, no armed entourage trailing him through airports, no name splashed across tabloid headlines. Damien had spent 2 decades building something far more dangerous than a reputation: invisibility. On paper, he was simply an investor, a quiet one. His name appeared on shareholder filings for a logistics conglomerate headquartered in Geneva, a luxury shipping firm with ports across 3 continents, a fuel distribution network that kept half of Eastern Europe's private aviation fleets running, and a construction holdings group responsible for some of the most secure infrastructure projects in the world. He sat on no boards. He gave no interviews. When journalists occasionally stumbled across his name, they found a man who seemed to exist mostly in footnotes, a silent partner, a private financier, the kind of figure whose money moved markets without ever moving headlines. What the footnotes didn't say was that Damien also held controlling interests, several layers removed through shell companies and trusts no forensic accountant had ever fully untangled, in airport security contractors across 4 countries, in private terminal operators, in aviation fuel suppliers, including, as it happened, the one currently servicing Ravencrest International. Most governments who'd ever crossed paths with him filed him under investor of interest. A small number, fewer than a dozen people across 3 continents, understood the truth beneath that label. They understood that the empire Damien had built wasn't simply built despite its darker foundations. It had been built because of them. Every legitimate company was a door. Every door led somewhere a man like Damien needed to walk unnoticed. He had learned early in his rise that loud men got arrested and quiet men got invited to dinner. So he had made himself quiet, unbearably, deliberately quiet. He let other men posture and threaten and announce themselves, and he watched them get dismantled one, by governments, by rivals, by their own arrogance, while he sat in rooms no one thought to search. That was the man standing in the rain at Ravencrest International, holding a torn authorization document in 2 pieces because a terminal supervisor 11 days into her promotion had decided she already knew exactly who he was. The negotiations that had brought him to the airport that morning had taken 11 months to arrange and 4 hours to complete. A private meeting, off any official itinerary, with men who controlled freight corridors Damien needed and were unwilling to admit they needed him more. It had gone exactly as he'd planned. Contracts signed, terms secured. Nothing on paper that would survive a subpoena, and nothing that needed to. Now he was simply trying to go home. His Gulfstream sat fueled and ready on the tarmac behind Vanessa Brooks, exactly where it had been for the past 40 minutes. The flight crew, 2 pilots and a flight attendant who had worked for him for 6 years and had long since stopped asking questions, waited inside, watching the confrontation unfold through the cockpit window with a particular stillness of people who already knew how this would end. Everything about the morning had been routine until it wasn't. Back of the staircase, the crowd hadn't thinned. If anything, it had grown. Vanessa stood with her arms crossed, visibly emboldened by the silence that had followed her declaration. The 2 security officers flanking Damien had begun asking questions now. Name, point of origin, intended destination, the kind of procedural interrogation typically reserved for people the staff had already decided were guilty. "Sir, can you confirm your full legal name?" one of them asked, notepad in hand. Damien answered, calmly, fully, without complaint. "And you can't produce a boarding pass for a commercial flight?" The officer pressed. "There isn't one," Damien said. This is a private aircraft. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, the look of two men who believed they'd caught someone in the act. Among the wealthy charter passengers still gathered along the rope, the mood had shifted from curiosity to entertainment. A silver-haired man in a navy overcoat who had been waiting nearly an hour for his own delayed flight seemed to find the whole spectacle a welcome distraction. "If it's really your jet," he called out, loud enough to draw a few chuckles from the people nearest him, "prove it. Walk up and start it yourself." A ripple of laughter passed through the small crowd. Even Vanessa allowed herself a thin smile, the first real satisfaction she'd shown all morning. Damien turned his head slightly toward the man. He didn't answer. He simply smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or an angry one. It was the smile of a man who had heard 1,000 versions of that same joke in 1,000 different rooms, and who understood, better than anyone watching him, exactly how short the distance was between laughter and silence. He reached into his jacket and withdrew his phone. The movement was unhurried. No flash of irritation, no theatrical pause for effect. He simply scrolled to a single contact, the kind saved under initials rather than a name, and pressed call. It rang once. "Activate Protocol Raven," Damien said. He didn't wait for a response. There wasn't one expected. He ended the call after 10 seconds and slid the phone back into his pocket, as unbothered as a man confirming a dinner reservation. For a moment, nothing happened at all. The silver-haired businessman laughed again, louder this time, certain he'd witnessed the final desperate bluff of a man caught in his own lie. Vanessa's smile widened. The security officers relaxed their stance, satisfied the confrontation was nearly over. Somewhere above them, the rain kept falling, steady and indifferent, the way it had been falling all morning. None of them noticed yet that deep inside Ravencrest International's operations center, a single encrypted alert had just appeared on 3 separate screens, and the people watching those screens were no longer laughing at all. For 2 minutes, nothing happened at all. The rain kept falling. The crowd kept watching. And Vanessa Brooks, standing at the center of it all with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, felt something close to triumph settle over her. "See," she said, glancing around at the gathered passengers as if inviting them to share the joke. Nothing. No private jet rescue team. No mysterious phone call cavalry. Just a man who got caught. A few people laughed again. The silver-haired businessman folded his arms, smug and satisfied. The way men are, when the world confirms exactly what they expected of it. Emboldened, Vanessa snatched the remaining half of Damien's torn authorization document from where it had fallen against the wet pavement and crumpled it fully in her fist. The gesture was small, almost theatrical, a period at the end of a sentence she believed she'd already won. "Move him back," she told the security officers, "all the way to the perimeter gate, and someone call the police. I want this documented as attempted trespass." The officers stepped forward, finally closing the last few feet of distance between themselves and Damien. He didn't resist. He simply shifted his weight, allowing them to flank him, his expression unreadable beneath the rain still beating on his collar. It was right around then that the first small thing happened. A fuel truck idling near Gate 41 of 3 currently servicing private departures shuddered to a stop mid-pump. The driver frowned at his dashboard, tapped at a screen, then radioed his supervisor. No response came back. He tried again. Still nothing but static and a faint, automated tone he didn't recognize. Inside the operations center, on the 2nd floor of the executive terminal, 3 phones began ringing at once. The duty manager, a heavy-set man named Frank Doyle, who had worked at Ravencrest for 19 years and had never once received an emergency directive outside of a scheduled drill, picked up the nearest line. "Operations, this is Doyle." He stopped talking less than 4 seconds later. His face went the particular shade of pale that comes from hearing words a person has never expected to hear, directed at them personally. Across the building, air traffic control received a notice that hadn't come through any of the usual federal channels, a designation most controllers had only seen referenced in training manuals, never issued in real time. Departures from the private aviation sector were to be held immediately. No explanation given, no estimated duration provided. "What is this?" one controller muttered to another, staring at the directive on his screen as though it might resolve itself if he looked at it long enough. It didn't. Within minutes, Two black government sedans pulled directly onto the tarmac through a maintenance gate that hadn't been used for vehicle access in over a year. Men in plain dark suits stepped out, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this before, somewhere else many times. They didn't speak to the gathered crowd. They didn't need to. Their badges did the talking, flashed briefly toward startled ground staff before they continued walking, directly toward the executive terminal entrance. Back of the staircase, none of this had reached the crowd yet. Vanessa was still mid-sentence explaining to the security officers exactly how she wanted the trespassing report filed when the first ripple of confusion reached her peripheral vision. A cluster of ground crew near the fuel trucks, gesturing at each other, phones pressed to their ears. "What's going on over there?" she asked, more irritated than concerned. Nobody answered her. Somewhere across the tarmac, a Bombardier Global 6000 that had been cleared for departure 11 minutes earlier suddenly received a hold notice from the tower. The pilot, halfway through his pre-takeoff checklist, stared at his radio in disbelief. "Tower, can you confirm? We were cleared. Hold position. All private departures are currently suspended. Stand by for further instruction." The pilot looked at his co-pilot. Neither of them had ever heard that phrase used outside of a security lockdown. Passengers waiting in the executive lounge began noticing it too. Flight statuses on the overhead displays flickering from on time to delayed to finally hold, one after another, like dominoes falling in slow motion. A woman near the window lowered her coffee cup, frowning at the screen. A man in a tailored suit stood and began pacing, phone pressed to his ear, asking someone on the other end what was happening, why his flight to Doha had just vanished from the board entirely. The recording phones along the gold rope had multiplied now. What had started as one curious bystander capturing a minor confrontation had become a dozen, all angling for a better view, sensing, the way crowds always seem to, that something larger than a denied boarding was unfolding around them. Ground crew stood frozen near their equipment, unsure whether to continue working or wait for instructions that weren't coming. Two managers sprinted across the tarmac toward the operations building, their radios crackling with overlapping voices, none of them making any sense yet. Vanessa still didn't understand. She watched the chaos spreading across the terminal with something between irritation and confusion, certain, absolutely certain that whatever was happening had nothing to do with the man standing quietly beside her, rain dripping from his collar, his expression as calm as it had been 20 minutes ago. It was the airport director, Charles Whitfield, who finally understood first. He was 3 floors up in his office overlooking the tarmac when his private line rang, a number reserved for only the most senior contacts in his network, a number that had rung perhaps 4 times in his entire 11-year tenure. He answered, "Teliant," and as the voice on the other end spoke, calm, precise, delivering information that made the blood drain visibly from Whitfield's face, his hand began to tremble around the receiver. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward into the wall. "Get me eyes on the executive terminal," he said into his radio, his voice no longer steady. "Now, I need to know exactly who is standing at gate 2. Below him, through the rain-streaked glass, Damien Volkov stood exactly where he'd been standing for the last 20 minutes, waiting. Charles Whitfield crossed the tarmac at a pace that no 11-year airport director should have been moving at. His suit jacket flapping open, rain soaking through his shoulders before he'd covered half the distance. Behind him, 2 of his senior staff struggled to keep up, exchanging glances that asked the same question neither of them dared voice aloud. The crowd near gate 2 parted instinctively as he approached, the way crowds do for someone radiating a particular kind of urgency, the kind that makes strangers step back without being asked. Whitfield stopped a few feet from the staircase. Rain dripped from the brim of his thinning hairline as he looked past Vanessa Brooks, past the 2 security officers still flanking him, directly at the man in the soaked grey suit. For a long moment, he simply stared. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. "Mr. Volkov." The 2 words landed in the wet air like a verdict of an entirely different kind than the one Vanessa had delivered 20 minutes earlier. Every conversation around the staircase died instantly. The recording phones, still raised along the gold rope, seemed to freeze along with everything else. The silver-haired businessman who had joked about proving ownership lowered his arms slowly, his smug expression draining away in real time. Somewhere behind him, a woman in a cream coat pressed a hand to her chest. Vanessa turned, frowning. "I'm sorry, you know him." Whitfield didn't answer her. He was still looking at Damien, and something in his expression had shifted from confusion into something closer to dread. "Sir," Whitfield said, his voice unsteady in a way that didn't match the polished authority he usually carried through this terminal. I am deeply sorry for this. There's clearly been a significant misunderstanding, and I need you to know that you can explain after," Damien said quietly. "Right now, I'd like my boarding pass returned. The half that's still readable." Whitfield turned sharply toward Vanessa, and for the first time since she'd stepped into Damien's path, true fear crossed her face. "Sir, I don't understand," she said, her voice climbing half an octave. "Who is he?" Whitfield exhaled, the kind of breath a man releases when he's about to say something that will end careers, possibly including his own. "Vanessa. This is Damien Volkov." The name meant nothing to her. It was clear from her blank expression that whatever reputation Damien carried through certain rooms of the world had never reached the 11 days of her promotion. "He's the founder and principal investor behind Meridian Holdings," Whitfield continued, his words coming faster now, almost frantic, as if speaking quickly enough could undo the last 20 minutes. "Meridian owns the fuel contracts for this airport's entire private aviation sector. They hold the cargo logistics agreement for Terminal C. They supply the security technology running through every checkpoint in this building, including the one you walked past this morning. Half of this airport's international freight infrastructure exists because his companies built it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, spreading outward like a current. "He doesn't charter aircraft, Vanessa." Whitfield's voice had dropped lower now, almost a whisper, the kind reserved for confessions. "He owns them." Vanessa's gaze snapped toward the Gulfstream behind Damien, toward the aircraft she had spent the last 20 minutes insisting belonged to someone else entirely. "That's not possible," she said weakly. "The charter logs show." "There is no charter," Damien said. It was the first time his voice had carried any weight beyond calm. "The aircraft is registered under Meridian Aviation Holdings. The crew has worked for me for 6 years. You can ask them yourself." As if summoned, the Gulfstream's cabin doors swung fully open, and the senior pilot, a graying man in the crisp uniform who had watched the entire confrontation unfold from the cockpit window with growing disbelief, descended the staircase 2 steps at a time. "Mr. Volkov, I'm so sorry. We tried to radio operations the moment this started. No one would." "It's all right, Tom," Damien said. The pilot turned to Whitfield, his expression tight with barely restrained frustration. "This aircraft belongs to Mr. Volkov. Tail number, registration, ownership documentation, it's all on file with your own private aviation office. We confirmed his identity to ground staff 40 minutes ago. We were told someone would escort him to the gate." Whitfield's face had gone the color of old paper. He turned slowly back toward Vanessa. "You denied the owner access to his own aircraft." The words seemed to physically strike her. She opened her mouth, searching for some explanation, some procedural justification that might still salvage the moment. But nothing came. The torn authorization document, the one she had ripped in half 20 minutes earlier, was still crumpled in her fist, the ink slightly smeared now from the rain. She looked down at it as if seeing it for the first time. Around the gold rope, the energy of the crowd had transformed completely. What had been entertainment, a public humiliation to pass the time during a delayed morning, had curdled into something closer to horror. The young man who'd been recording from row 4 lowered his phone and, after a brief hesitation, began scrolling frantically to delete the footage. Beside him, another spectator did the same. A woman who had laughed loudest at Vanessa's earlier remarks now stared at her shoes, suddenly very interested in the wet pavement. The silver-haired businessman who dared Damien to prove ownership had already turned and walked briskly away from the staircase, disappearing into the terminal without a backward glance. Vanessa stood alone at the center of it all, the crowd that had once seemed to validate her certainty, now retreating from her like water from a drain. "Mr. Volkov," she said, her voice barely audible now. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't." "I know," Damien said. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. The silence that followed carried more weight than any accusation could have, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Vanessa Brooks understood, with a cold, sinking clarity, exactly how badly she had misjudged the man standing in front of her. Above them, the rain continued to fall, indifferent to the wreckage it had quietly witnessed unfold. Now everyone knows who he is, but knowing isn't the same as understanding what comes next. Vanessa thought the worst part was over. She was wrong. The airport is about to grind to a complete stop, and the questions Damien asks next will be far more dangerous than anything security could throw at him. Keep reading to watch an entire institution unravel in real time, one uncomfortable truth at a time. The two men in dark suits who had arrived through the maintenance gate reached the staircase within minutes of Whitfield's confession, moving through the dispersing crowd with the quiet authority of people who answered to no one currently standing on that tarmac. Federal Aviation Security, the taller of the two said, holding up credentials Vanessa barely registered. We need everyone involved in this incident to remain on site. That includes you, ma'am. Behind them, two more sedans pulled through the same gate, followed by a black SUV that parked at an angle blocking the executive terminal's main exit. Whoever had been notified by Damien's call 22 minutes earlier had not sent a token response. They had sent a machine. Within 15 minutes, Ravencrest International's private aviation sector had effectively stopped functioning. Every fuel truck on the tarmac sat idle. Drivers ordered to remain with their vehicles. Air traffic control had extended the hold notice indefinitely, citing an active security review, a phrase that sent a fresh wave of confusion through every cockpit waiting on the runway. 3 luxury departures, including a flight carrying a well-known hedge fund manager and his family to Aspen, sat motionless on the tarmac while their owners grew increasingly vocal inside the cabin. In the executive lounge, the mood had curdled from inconvenience into outrage. A man in a cashmere coat was loudly informing anyone who would listen that he had a board meeting in Zurich in 6 hours and that someone was going to answer for this. A woman near the window was on the phone with what sounded like a lawyer, demanding to know whether the airport could be held liable for operational negligence. Nobody in the lounge yet understood that the cause of their delay was standing calmly on the tarmac below them, rain still beading on his collar, declining every offer extended to him, because the offers had already begun. Whitfield himself led the first wave, flanked now by 2 members of the airport's legal team who had been roused from a Monday morning that had, until 90 minutes ago, looked entirely unremarkable. Mr. Volkov, on behalf of Ravencrest International, I want to offer you our deepest apologies, Whitfield said, his voice still carrying the strain of a man watching his career narrow toward a single exit. We'd like to arrange a full VIP escort to your aircraft, immediate compensation for the delay, and I can personally guarantee lifetime complimentary access to all our private aviation services, effective today. Damien said nothing. We can also assign a dedicated private security detail for any future visits, one of the lawyers added quickly, to ensure nothing remotely like this ever happens again. Damien looked at the woman as she spoke, his expression unreadable, then turned his gaze back toward the terminal building, toward the cluster of executives now gathering at a respectful distance, watching the conversation unfold with the particular helplessness of people accustomed to solving problems with money and discovering for the first time that it wasn't working. I didn't come here for an escort, Damien said finally, or compensation, or lifetime access to anything. Whitfield blinked. Then, please, Mr. Volkov, whatever you need, we are prepared to. What I need, Damien said, is for someone to answer one question. The tarmac fell quiet enough that the rain seemed louder than it had all morning. When did appearance become more believable than documentation? Nobody answered. Whitfield opened his mouth, then closed it. One of the lawyers glanced down at her shoes. The security officers who had flanked Damien 20 minutes earlier, who had questioned his name, his origin, his right to stand where he was standing, said nothing at all. Damien let the silence sit. He wasn't interested in filling it himself. I presented a signed authorization document the moment I arrived, he continued, his voice still level, still without any trace of anger. It was authentic. Every detail on it could have been verified in under 60 seconds with a single phone call to your own registration office. Instead, it was torn in half by someone who never looked at it. He turned finally toward Vanessa, who stood several feet away now, flanked by the federal officers who had instructed her to remain on site. Not because the document was unconvincing, Damien said, but because I didn't look like someone she expected to be telling the truth. Vanessa's face had gone pale beneath the rain. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, some instinct still reaching for the same certainty that had carried her through the last 20 minutes. And then, visibly, the instinct collapsed, because she understood in that moment that she had nothing to offer. Not really. She hadn't checked the registration. She hadn't called the private aviation office. She hadn't so much as glanced twice at the document before deciding, within the first 10 seconds of meeting him, exactly who Damien Volkov was and exactly what he deserved. She had assumed, and an assumption, she now understood with sickening clarity, was not the same thing as being right. It had simply felt the same, for as long as no one challenged it. "I wasn't lying," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. I was so sure." "That's the problem," Damien said, not unkindly, almost gently, in a way that made it worse. "You were sure. You were never right. You never checked to find out if there was a difference." Whitfield, standing a few feet away, looked as though he very much wished he were somewhere else. Beyond the gold rope, the media vans had begun arriving, drawn by whispers, spreading faster than any official statement by passengers texting friends about a billionaire detained on the tarmac by the dozen videos that had already, despite frantic attempts to delete them, begun circulating somewhere they could no longer be contained. Ravencrest International, for the first time in its history, had stopped breathing entirely, and at the center of it stood a man who hadn't raised his voice once, who hadn't needed to. Watching an airport built on contracts that quietly bore his name slowly come to understand exactly what it had done. The formal investigation began less than an hour later, conducted not in some distant federal office, but in a windowless conference room on the second floor of the executive terminal, with rain still streaking the glass behind drawn blinds. Security footage from 4 separate cameras was pulled and sent within the first 20 minutes, angles from the staircase, the gold rope, the fuel depot, and the operations center itself. The federal investigators reviewed it twice in silence before anyone spoke. The footage was unambiguous. Damien had presented his documentation within the first 90 seconds of the encounter. Vanessa had not examined it. She had dismissed it, then torn it, then escalated the confrontation in front of a gathering crowd, all without once picking up a phone to confirm what a single call could have settled instantly. Witness statements, by contrast, were a mess. The 2 security officers who had flanked Damien insisted they'd simply been following Vanessa's direction, that questioning his identity hadn't been their call to make. Vanessa insisted she'd acted on standard protocol, that irregular presentations were common and warranted scrutiny, though when pressed to identify which specific protocol she meant, she couldn't name one. The silver-haired businessman who had mocked Damien earlier had already left the property and, when reached by phone, claimed he didn't really see much and had just been passing through. The ground crew member who'd first noticed the fuel trucks stop offered the only statement that didn't contradict itself, mostly because he hadn't been involved in the confrontation at all. By the time Whitfield reviewed the full file, the truth sitting at the bottom of it was no longer in question. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been a decision made in seconds, defended for 20 minutes, and never once revisited, even as the evidence to revisit it sat folded in Damien's hand the entire time. Whitfield called Vanessa into the conference room alone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The federal investigators sat at the far end of the table, silent witnesses to a conversation that was, in its own quieter way, just as final as anything that had happened on the tarmac. "You denied a verified owner access to his own aircraft," Whitfield said. "You destroyed his documentation rather than confirm it. You escalated a private matter into a public spectacle that has now drawn federal scrutiny, media attention, and, as of an hour ago, a formal review of every contract Meridian Holdings maintains with this airport." Vanessa said nothing. There was nothing left to say. "Your badge is revoked, effective immediately." She unclipped it slowly. The gold identification she had worn with such certainty that morning, now feeling in her hand like something borrowed from a life she no longer had access to. She set it on the table. "Your uniform will need to be returned by end of day." She nodded once, her eyes fixed somewhere past Whitfield's shoulder, unable to meet anyone's gaze directly. When she finally rose and walked out of the conference room past the row of staff who had gathered in the hallway pretending not to watch the silence that followed her, was its own kind of verdict, louder in its way than anything Vanessa had said to Damien at the staircase that morning. It was nearly 2 hours later when Whitfield, along with the airport's general counsel and 3 senior executives, finally sat across from Damien in a smaller room down the hall, the federal hold on departures still technically active, though privately everyone understood it would lift the moment Damien said it should. "Mr. Volkov," Whitfield began carefully, We understand if you intend to pursue legal action. Given what's transpired, we wouldn't contest it. We'd also understand if you wanted certain individuals terminated, beyond Miss Brooks. There were others who failed to intervene. Damien shook his head slightly. I'm not here for revenge. The room waited. What I want, he said, is for this to never happen to anyone else who walks through that terminal, regardless of what they're wearing, what they look like, or what someone decides about them in the first 4 seconds of meeting them. He laid out his terms with the same unhurried precision he'd shown all morning. Mandatory verification procedures for every private terminal interaction, with documented confirmation required before any escalation could occur. An independent third-party investigation into how the incident had been allowed to unfold for 20 minutes without a single supervisor intervening. Mandatory bias and de-escalation training for every employee with public-facing authority. A complete overhaul of documentation protocols, ensuring no authorization could be dismissed without a recorded verification attempt. And, perhaps most significantly, a permanent audit trail. Every decision made by terminal staff regarding access or denial would now be logged, time-stamped, and reviewable. Every decision recorded, Damien said. No more assumptions hiding behind standard procedure. If someone makes a call, like the one made this morning, there will be a record of exactly what they checked and exactly what they didn't. The executives exchanged glances, but no one objected. There was nothing left to negotiate from. Whitfield cleared his throat. We'll have all of this drafted and implemented by end of week. I give you my word. Damien nodded once, then rose from his chair. The conversation apparently concluded. He paused at the door, looking back at the room of executives who had spent the last 2 hours offering him everything they had. Apologies, compensation, privilege, none of which he had wanted. I wasn't testing your security, he said quietly. A pause settled over the room, heavy enough that no one dared fill it. I was witnessing your character. The silence that followed lasted long after he'd gone. By that evening, the first reforms were already underway. New verification checklists were being printed and distributed to every terminal supervisor on shift. A temporary documentation log had been set up at the executive entrance, requiring 2 confirmed checks before any access could be denied. Somewhere in the operations center, a junior IT staffer worked quietly past midnight, building the audit system that would, from that day forward, ensure no decision at Ravencrest International would ever again be made and forgotten in silence. Chapter 7. Real power never introduces itself. It was nearly 4 o'clock. By the time Damien finally walked up the staircase he had been denied 3 hours earlier, the rain had thinned to a fine mist. The kind that didn't fall so much as hang in the air, softening the harsh lights of the tarmac into something almost gentle. Damien climbed the steps slowly, unhurried even now, the leather travel bag still in hand, as if the last 3 hours had cost him nothing but a delay he'd already accounted for. At the top, Tom, the senior pilot who had descended in a fury hours earlier, stood waiting just inside the cabin door, his uniform pressed, his expression carrying an apology he clearly felt he owed even though he hadn't done anything wrong. Mr. Volkov. He stepped aside to let Damien pass. I'm sorry it took this long. We should have gotten you on board the moment ground staff confirmed your identity. That delay is on us. It isn't, Damien said simply, setting his bag down beside his seat. You did exactly what you were supposed to. The failure wasn't yours. Tom nodded, though something in his face suggested the apology had needed saying regardless of whether it had been earned. The flight attendant, a woman who had worked alongside Tom for nearly as long as she'd worked for Damien, offered him a quiet, genuine smile as she passed through the cabin. The kind of smile that didn't ask anything of him, didn't need anything from him, simply acknowledged that he was finally where he belonged. Damien settled into his seat and looked out through the rain-streaked window at the terminal he was leaving behind. It looked different now than it had 3 hours ago. The gold rope where the crowd had gathered stood empty. The placard reading Pori FT8, F-Flight, ACCESS restricted, was still bolted in place beside the staircase, indifferent to everything that had unfolded beneath it. Federal vehicles remained parked near the maintenance gate, their presence a quiet reminder that the investigation, while concluded for Damien's purposes, was far from over for everyone else. Somewhere inside that terminal, he knew, the new documentation logs were already being installed. The bias training modules were being drafted. An institution that had operated for years on assumption and hierarchy was in the span of a single afternoon being forced to rebuild itself around the simple idea that everyone, regardless of how they looked standing in the rain, deserved to be verified rather than judged. He thought, unexpectedly, of his mentor. The man had been dead 11 years now, but his voice still surfaced at moments like this. Quiet, unhurried, delivered over a glass of something strong in a room with no windows. The loudest man usually has the least power, he had told Damien once, decades earlier, when Damien was young enough to still believe that respect had to be demanded to be real. He has to announce himself, because no one else will. The man who's actually dangerous never needs you to know it. He simply waits, and when the moment comes, the truth speaks for him. Damien hadn't fully understood it then. He understood it now, completely. Sitting in a cabin that was unmistakably his, having said almost nothing for 3 hours while an entire airport dismantled and rebuilt itself around a single torn document. He hadn't argued. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't once raised his voice or revealed who he was until the moment revealed itself. He had simply insisted, quietly, patiently, that the same standard be applied to him as would have been applied to anyone else. And in that insistence, everything else had unraveled on its own. Through the window, he watched a figure cross the wet tarmac toward the staff parking lot, far enough away that her face wasn't visible, but close enough that he recognized the Navy uniform, or what remained of it. Vanessa Brooks walked with a cardboard box held against her hip, her scarf gone, her badge gone, her posture nothing like the confident, polished woman who had stepped into his path that morning. She didn't look back at the terminal. She didn't look toward the jet. She simply walked, alone, toward whatever came next in a life that had changed completely in the span of 20 minutes. Damien felt no satisfaction watching her go, only a quiet, settled certainty that the consequence had been hers to create, and hers alone to carry. Inside the terminal, behind glass he could no longer see clearly through the mist, life continued in its altered form. Whitfield remained under review. His future at Ravencrest no longer guaranteed, regardless of how swiftly the reforms were implemented. The executives who had offered Damien compensation and escorts and lifetime privileges were now drafting statements for a board that would ask difficult questions for months. And the passengers who had laughed, who had filmed, who had whispered, who had assumed exactly what Vanessa had assumed, would carry the memory of that morning longer than they expected to. Some would tell the story as a warning. Others would simply remember the particular discomfort of having laughed at the wrong moment for the wrong reasons, at the wrong man. The employees who remained, the ground crew, the gate staff, the security officers who had questioned him without ever checking his documents, would not forget either, not because anyone forced them to remember, but because some mornings reshaped the people who lived through them, whether they intended to or not. The engines began to hum beneath him. Tom's voice crackled gently over the intercom, informing him they were cleared for taxi. The Gulfstream rolled slowly away from the terminal, past the staircase, past the gold rope, past the placard that had meant nothing in the end. Along the windows of the executive lounge, faces watched the aircraft pass. The same faces that had smirked and recorded and joked 3 hours earlier, now pressed close to the glass in total silence. No one waved. No one spoke. They simply watched the jet move past them, slow and unbothered, carrying away the man they had all, in their own way, gotten wrong. Damien looked out the window one last time as the aircraft turned onto the runway, the terminal shrinking behind him into a blur of rain and glass. He had never sought recognition. He had never once revealed his influence to win the argument. Not when it would have ended the confrontation in seconds. Not when it would have spared him 3 hours standing in the rain. He had simply asked that the same procedure be followed for him as for anyone else, and let the truth do the rest of the work on its own. The jet lifted off the runway and disappeared into the storm-darkened sky, leaving behind an airport still quietly absorbing the cost of a single, careless assumption, and a lesson that for everyone who had witnessed it would not be easy to forget. True power, after all, does not introduce itself. It does not argue for respect, and it never demands special treatment. It waits, and when the truth finally arrives, arrogance is left with nowhere left to hide. This is what real power looks like. Quiet, patient, and impossible to fake. If this story hits you the way it hit us, follow for more stories where the quietest person in the room turns out to be the most dangerous one. Drop a comment. Would you have checked the documents, or assumed like Vanessa did? Share this with someone who needs the reminder that appearances lie, character never does.